All right, class. Unit 3 is titled North American Colonies. So we are getting to the point in the timeline where we're going to start talking slowly about the emergence of the modern United States, working up towards the revolution. So, let me make sure I'm sharing this. Okay. We're not going to get to the revolution in this unit. We'll probably get to the revolution in the next unit and spend a couple units on that. It's a pretty pivotal event, obviously, in early American history. But before that, the British colonies kind of pre-revolution. A lot of what we talk about in this unit is going to be more about sociology, about social issues, birth rates, things like that. So Puritan immigrants to New England. Um, New England was very unique compared to the mid-Atlantic and southern colonies in a few ways, and the text points out one that's just a wild disparity. Life expectancy in New England, it was about 70, which is really quite high for back then. I mean, think about it; they didn't have antibiotics. Uh, that's a wildly high life expectancy for that part of the world at that time, given the climate and the lack of modern medicine and so 70 is pretty high. By contrast, at the same time in Virginia was under 40. It's about half, for any number of reasons. So that's a wild disparity, just sociologically speaking. The number of New Englanders doubled every 27 years because they were generally healthier and living longer and having more children. The population grew more rapidly. Not that, 60-year-olds were having babies, but just the fact that they're living twice as long as people in Virginia are, for example, the population is going to grow. It's going to just be a higher absolute number, just basic math. While the populations of Europe and Virginia barely reproduced themselves. So we're going to get back to that and spend a decent amount of time on that issue. Um, Reproducing themselves. What does that mean? What's the implication in any society if for whatever reason the population is not growing? What causes that? What are the effects of that? What can be done about that? We'll spend some time talking about that in a minute. Another major distinction um, with between Virginia and New England, for example, while Virginia abounded with servants, tenant farmers, and enslaved people, almost every adult male in New England owned property. Now, personally, I think that's probably a little exaggerated. This textbook is the only time I've heard that claim. Almost every, that's vague, right? But honestly, almost every adult, to me, that means like what, 80%, 90%? Almost every adult male owned property. Maybe, whatever the number was, it was surely much, much higher than it would have been in Virginia because, as they point out, Virginia had a lot of things that New England had relatively little of, i.e., indentured servants, tenant farmers, and slaves. And obviously, none of those people would have owned property. So later on in American history, as we'll cover, and as I'm sure you know, there are a lot of distinctions between New England and the Southern colonies, for example. Very often those distinctions are exaggerated, but they were real. All right. And this book is kind of previewing, and you can guess like what are the down the road effects going to be of one part of the country has high property ownership, for example, and relatively little slavery, whereas another part of the country has relatively low property ownership and much more slavery. There's going to be serious sociological and economic consequences to that, as you probably know. Another thing in New England that's quite unique, Roger Williams founded Rhode Island as a safe haven for people fleeing religious persecution in Massachusetts and elsewhere. We talked about the Protestant Reformation, I believe, in the last unit. In those divisions, between different denominations of Christianity followed the European immigrants to America. It wasn't nearly as violent as it was in Europe, but there were still divisions and persecutions. There was no freedom of religion as we know it at this point in the early British colonies. And so what we would see, for example, is in Massachusetts, certain Protestant denominations persecuted certain other Protestant denominations and drove them out. And Roger Williams had what we all take for granted, but at the time was a pretty radical idea that the way to end that cycle of retribution and persecution was to guarantee what we all take for granted now, freedom of religion. Rhode Island became the first colony to guarantee freedom of religion, and this is key for all faiths, not just certain Christian denominations. So Roger Williams, and as a native Rhode Islander, this is a thing that we take pride in Rhode Island. It's not a whole lot to take pride in there, and this is a big one. Um, this lithograph here, this image is of the statue of Roger Williams in Roger Williams Park. They have a very highly renowned zoo there. Maybe you've been to, even if you're not from there. But Roger Williams Park in that cabin is from one of his descendants. This is right around the corner from where I grew up. Roger Williams is a big deal in Rhode Island to this day. And his revolutionary idea was Rhode Island was going to be a place where there's going to be legal freedom of religion for everybody, not just different types of Catholics and Protestants, but even non-Christians. And again, at the time, we're like, well, now rather, we're like, yeah, whatever, obviously. That wasn't, at the time, it was radical. And that's how these things go. Something that today is a radical concept, 50 years from now is just going to be common sense. That's the evolution, right? So at the time, this was radical. Later on, the other colonies, and then later, as you know, the states, once we became a country, the states all followed this precedent of freedom of religion. And not just for Christian denominations. This is a photograph from inside Truro Synagogue. It is a Jewish temple. It's a synagogue, and it's in Newport, Rhode Island. And it's the oldest Jewish house of worship on this side of the planet in the Western Hemisphere. And why is it in little old Rhode Island? It's not a coincidence. It's there because it's the only place it could be where Jews could be safe from persecution. It's in Rhode Island. Roger Williams, who again founded Rhode Island, also argued that the King of England or any other European ruler that should say no right, had no right to claim lands that Native Americans had not willingly sold to them. Now, in the context of the time, in terms of how Europeans tended to treat Native Americans, this was relatively civilized and empathetic, right? Seems like a pretty obvious statement to us, but again, at the time it was radical. The idea that the King of England or France or Spain or anywhere else, they had no right to Native American land unless the Native Americans willingly sold the land to them. Now, here's the thing. We can admire and respect what Roger Williams was arguing here. That's all good. But I do want to take care to stipulate even when the Native Americans, quote, willingly sold land to Europeans, obviously that's preferable to having it seized, but willingly sold, don't assume that the price was always fair or that the willingly part was truly, as consensual as we might want it to have been, right? Surely, selling is preferable to having it seized, but that willingly sold could, depending on the situation, be a little misleading. All right, so just keep that in mind. A lot of times there might have been some, not from Roger Williams necessarily, but from other people, they might have wanted it to look like, hey, they willingly sold us this land, and in reality, there may very well have been a degree of coercion, right? Kind of like sell us the land and at least you'll get something, or we're going to take it. Is that a willing sale? All right, I just want to make sure you're considering that. Now, back to the population issue. Uh, British North America had a fertility rate of 7 or 8. That's a lot, right? That's a very high average birth rate, right? Fertility rate on average between 7 and 8 children per family. It's very high. As in other countries, fertility rates declined, and we'll compare this to our current situation. We'll compare this to other countries, but this is a general rule when we're talking about fertility rates. As countries go through certain changes, the birth rate declines. Sorry, what are those changes? As the nation became more developed and urban, those two kind of go hand in hand. That's a little bit repetitive. Let's just say as nations become more urbanized and wealthy, and as women gain more control over their bodies and their lives. I apologize for the interruption, little technical issue there. All right. Sorry for the interruption, technical issue. Um, so as nations become more developed, urban, and wealthy, and as women gain more control over their bodies and their lives. So let's break that apart one by one. As nations become more urbanized, let's say, they're more cities rather than people living in rural environments. Over time, the United States has gotten more urbanized, as you know. There's more big cities as our history progresses. Okay. Why would that lead to fewer children? Cities are very expensive. Cities are very densely populated, crowded. Those are just practical reasons. If you live out in a rural environment on a farm where there's room. You can have a bunch of kids. There's room for them to run around. Also, if you live in a rural environment on a farm, for example, those kids could be sources of labor and put them to work on the farm. By contrast, if you live in a little teeny apartment in a city, there's not room for 7 or 8 kids. There's not physical, practical space in a city the way there is in more rural areas. And cities are very expensive. That reality will lead to, on average, fewer children. As countries get more wealthy, this might seem like a paradox. Wealthier countries have fewer kids than poor countries. Might be a paradox, but wealth correlates with certain other things. Wealthier countries tend to be more urbanized, so that means fewer kids for reasons we just talked about. And wealthier countries have more access to safe, affordable, reliable birth control. And that's what they're referring to by women gained more control over their bodies and their lives, as women have more legal rights and practically speaking, again, more access to reliable, effective birth control. That's going to lead to fewer children. So, over the history of the United States, the birth rate, as you can see, has plummeted. The one aberration to the constant downward trend over 200 plus years, the one aberration where it rose briefly and then started to plummet again, was the baby boom. You've probably heard of that after World War II. That's the exception that proves the rule. The birth rate has been plummeting for 200 years in our country. So, what are the implications of that? I'm going to show you. Well, let's jump ahead to the modern implication globally, not just here, of why it's important to think about birth rates. The study of This is about the study of demographics. All right, demographics is the study of human population. And in its simplest form, demographics is the study of who's having babies and who's not. And however we define groups of people, we can categorize people by race, by ethnicity, by religion, by language, by where they live, by how tall they are, by whether they like football or basketball, however you want to categorize people, who's having kids and who isn't. And that shapes the future of the world. So there's a saying demographics is destiny. So let's look at birth rates now in the modern context. Um, our country's fertility rate is below 2 at this point, and that's called the replacement rate. Replacement rate is 2.1. So if in any group, let's say the group we're talking about here is our entire country, in the United States, if women on average, if each woman on average has 2.1 children, that's called a replacement rate. Our population will remain steady and it will not shrink. So let's break down why that is. 2.1. This isn't biology class, but it takes two adult humans to make a baby. When two adults create a baby, they haven't replaced themselves yet. If two adults have two babies, those two adults have just replaced themselves in the population. Does that make sense? When the adults grow up and die, eventually, the population will remain steady because the adults, quote, replaced themselves by bringing two little miniature baby humans into the world. That's replacement rate. If every adult couple in the United States, on average, has two children per adult couple, the population will remain very steady. So two is the replacement rate. 2.1, that point one is basically a rounding issue, has to be a little over two to account for that. That point one represents the children that are born that grow up to not have children themselves for whatever reason. Maybe they just choose not to, maybe they can't, maybe they die before they're of childbearing age, whatever it is. But let's just simplify it. Let's just say it's two. Two grown-ups hook up, have twins, they just replace themselves. Okay? At its simplest level. That's replacement rate. Okay. If you have more than two children per couple, your population will increase over time, right? I am a father of three. My wife and I have exceeded replacement rate, and I hope and pray to have a bunch of little squishy grandbabies someday. And the more the better. And then our population of our little group will grow over time. If if a couple of adults produce over the course of their lifetime one baby or none, it's simple math. The population of that group will go down. Basic math, right? Makes sense? Now let's look at throughout the world, who's having babies and who isn't. Everything in blue and purple is below replacement rate. Look at the trends. Who's not having kids? Well, let me see about the crudest, most oversimplified way to put it is White people and Chinese people are not having kids, and others, but those are the two huge outlier, or the ones that really jump off the map here, right? The major centers of population where people are not replacing themselves straight up, just not having enough babies to maintain their numbers. Look at Europe. Europe's below one. I mean, I don't know what's going on in Europe. Hey, whatever. Good luck with that. If you don't have kids in 100 years, your group, however that group is defined, will not exist. It's basic math and biology. Look at Europe. The Portuguese, the Spanish, the Germans, the Poles, the Italians. For whatever reason, they don't think it's important to replace themselves, and they're not. Okay, let me know how that works out for you. United States, Brazil, Russia, China, different cultural and economic, and a lot of reasons might go into this, but the inevitable result is if you don't replace yourselves, your group, however you define it, will not exist in the future. Simple math. Okay. Who is replacing themselves and then some, whose populations are increasing? Most of Africa, right? Parts of Southeast Asia, Oceania, Philippines, Cambodia, a couple countries in Latin America, for whatever cultural or economic reasons, they're having kids. People in Poland are not. People in Kenya are. So, what does the future look like? It's staring right at you on this map. You don't need to be smart to predict the future in this case. In 100 years from now, the Earth will be far less white. Specifically, Europeans will be almost non-existent. There will be far more Africans. And what doesn't show up on this map, but what I can tell you is there will be many, many more Muslims and many, many more Catholics. There will be far fewer Russians, Europeans, Chinese, etc. And there will be far fewer atheists because religious people of any religion, any devoutly religious group on average tends to have way more children than non-religious people. That's just a reality that we can measure as well. So the future will be more African, more Muslim, more Catholic, and much less white. That's demographics is destiny. There's no way around it unless the behavior changes. It's just simple math and biology, right? So when you think about these issues on a very just basic level, whatever you think about, maybe you have kids, maybe you don't, maybe you haven't thought about it yet, maybe you've decided you don't want it, whatever it is, just a base level proposition of common sense. Children get their ideas and their values largely from their parents. Think about for yourself whatever ideas and behaviors and values that you consider to be good, true, and beautiful. If you don't have kids, that value system will not exist in the future. Period. The value systems and belief systems that will dominate the future, whether you like them or not, are those that are held and passed on by people who have lots of kids. All right. Demographics is destiny. Now, one more thing I want to point out about this. You'll notice the United States is below replacement rate in terms of birth rate, but our population is not shrinking. How could that be? There are two ways to maintain or increase your population. One is the natural way, have babies. The other is through immigration. Make sense? So As I look over on the map here in East Asia, if you can see my cursor, Japan and South Korea have a twofold problem here. They are way below replacement rate. They're not having babies. They also don't allow immigration. Japan and South Korea have a decision to make in the very near future. Start having babies or open up your borders to immigration. You got to pick one because if they do neither, Japan and South Korea 100 years from now will just be empty of humans. There'll be nobody there. Got to pick one. So with the United States, if our birth rate dips below two, that's not the end of the world because we allow more immigration than any country in the history of the world. And by the way, so the other political kind of correlation here is if our native population, if the people that already live in our country are having a bunch of kids, we don't need immigration. We always have it as an option, right? So let's go back one more time to this data point. In British North America, if the people that were here, first, second, third generation immigrants, were having 7 or 8 kids, we don't need to worry, like we don't need more immigrants. In areas in the southern colonies where the birth rate was much lower, they needed constantly to bring in new people. The Enlightenment, leading figures of the Enlightenment stress the power of human reason. I don't know if we talked about the Enlightenment. You may have heard about it in different courses, just kind of this umbrella term given to this kind of philosophical and scientific evolution and thought around this time. Stress the power of human reason to promote progress by revealing the laws that governed both nature and society. So the Enlightenment had two lanes. The scientific lane was figuring out as much as possible about science, about the laws that govern nature. And during the Enlightenment, there were huge leaps forward in figuring out certain truths, certain natural laws about gravity and germs and astronomy, and that's all great. The other lane was the more political, sociological lane, figuring out the laws that governed society. Now, we can all agree that there are laws that govern nature. The laws of gravitation are the laws of gravitation, and they don't care whether or not you agree with them. The idea that there are laws, like ironclad rules that govern society is up for debate. All right, that's a much trickier proposition. But the Enlightenment had basically two lanes, right? The scientific lane and the political lane. And Benjamin Franklin, pictured here, kind of had a foot in both, right? He was a scientist and a political philosopher. We talked in um, last unit briefly about maybe not all that briefly, about the Protestant Reformation and another kind of offshoot of this evolution in religious thought. It was deism. They point out that some embraced deism, which rejected the divinity of Jesus and looked to nature rather than the Bible for proof of God's existence. Deism has been defined in different ways, um, but basically it doesn't reject belief in God, but it rejects the older traditional kind of theistic Judeo-Christian Islamic type of religion in favor of a more nature-based, kind of more spiritual rather than religious type of belief in God. So this graphic here, again, there's different ways to break this down. This is as they go. This is sufficient. Um, Judeo-Christian, the older traditional monotheistic view is number one, God exists, obviously, and number two, God is transcendent and immanent. God is involved in our existence, and you know, ideas like you can have a personal relationship with God, and prayer is good and useful, and God is present in certain events historical events or events in our personal lives, right? God is transcendent and immanent. Deism, which is kind of the more nature-based view, is that God exists, but God is not involved. God is transcendent, but not immanent. He's not involved in things, right? You can't have a relationship with God. It's more that it's the belief that God created the universe, but then that's it. He basically built a machine, being the universe, and set it in motion, and then that's it, right? So the universe that we live in and that we can investigate and observe is this incredibly complex thing that was created by God, but that's it. There's no, God sent his son to earth in the fullness of time to save us from our sins. There's none of that stuff in deism. And then secularism or atheism is there is no God. The world, the material world that you perceive, that's it. That's the end and the beginning. That's all there is to it, right? And any view of creation that involves God is a fantasy, right? That's the more secular, atheistic view. And so throughout the course of American history, those three camps have kind of ebbed and flowed. And today, I would say the secular view is certainly more, I don't want to say it's dominant, but the secular non-religious worldview is more widespread, certainly, than it ever has been in our history. And by the way, to go back to the last issue we were talking about, secular people, on average, in general, don't have as many kids. So as countries move away from high degrees of traditional religious belief, they have fewer kids. It always works that way, right? To go back to this map real quick. If you do a correlation on this map of low birth rate and low um, percentages of traditional religious belief, it's the same map. Europe as a whole has almost entirely rejected its traditional religious practices. If you ever go to Europe, it's full of big, beautiful cathedrals that are empty. The only people in them is, tourists walking through for 5 minutes to take pictures. Europe statistically has largely moved away from religion and they're not having kids. Those two things almost always go hand in hand, right? So all these issues are connected. Um, the last few things here in this kind of just unit that kind of bridges where we started with what we're moving into in the center of the course, being the revolution, is a diverse lot of Americans found themselves continually at odds with each other. Tell me if this sounds familiar to you. I'm going to paraphrase this. Americans are diverse. Does that sound familiar to you? Americans fight over everything all the time. Does that sound familiar to you? Americans argue about religion. Americans have conflict over racial and ethnic tensions, and they're divided between people that live in cities and people that don't. No way. This is a timeless reality of this country. This map here is it goes to the last issue they point out. There's a lot of different types of divisions in this country, and one of the major ones is between urban areas, cities, and rural areas. And that's always been a big dividing line in this country. They point this out even before it was a country, it was a dividing line. This map shows the 2016, I believe it's 2016, presidential election by county, not by state. I mean, you can see the states, but within the states, you can see the counties, right? By county. This is 2016. This is the election in which uh, it was President Trump versus Hillary Clinton. And in this map, President Trump is represented in red and Hillary Clinton's represented in blue. Okay. you can see that President Trump won the huge majority of the counties. And by the way, in 2020 and 2024, in every election that Trump has been in, he's won more counties every time. The county map that you see here has gotten more red every time Trump has won. Okay. Including the election that he was found to have lost, he won way more counties than he did the previous time. So the majority of counties in this country in the last three elections voted for President Trump. But as you know, probably they're mostly rural counties, which means they have far fewer people in them than the urban areas, right? So it looks like if you just look at the geography of the counties, look, you can drive across the entire country and never leave Trump country. But in this election, the blue representing Hillary Clinton, she got m more votes, a lot more votes than President Trump did. There are way more people in the blue areas of this map than there are in the red, even though the red areas are far, far bigger. And this is indicative of this huge political divide in our country. Look at probably the most on point part of the country where you can see that is the Midwest. Look at Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, if you can see that region. Those states are all red, but they each have three or four big blue islands in them. See that? Those three or four or five big blue islands in those Midwest states. What are those? Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, Columbus, Indianapolis, the big cities in the Midwest, surrounded by rural areas that vote much differently than the cities do. So that divide is not new. That urban versus rural divide, not new at all. Before the revolution, something called the 7 Years' War. We don't need to get too into the weeds on that, but the complex system of alliances that was supposed to keep Europe at peace began to fail. Something very similar happened with World War I. A system of alliances is intended to prevent war, which is great. Countries join alliances for strength in numbers. And if you're in an alliance with a bunch of other countries, the idea is no one will dare attack you because all of your friends will jump in and it'll turn into this huge conflict that nobody wants, right? And when that works, it's great. The problem with that system is that when it fails, it escalates immediately into something far more destructive than it otherwise would have been, right? If one small country attacks another small country, that should be a small, limited issue that doesn't affect that many people. But if both of those small countries are in alliances with 10 or 12 other countries, now all of a sudden, if two small countries go to war, now there's 30 countries that jump in. Now it's a world war. And so that something similar to that happened in the 7 Years' War. And that's why some historians now refer to it as, quote, the First World War, because what happens 150 years later with World War I, there's a lot of parallels, right? And you can see on this map that this was a war that was fought on, multiple different continents at the same time. So by that definition, you could also argue that it was kind of a prototype of the First World War in the 20th century. The aftermath of that war, the 7 Years' War, in retrospect, you could argue leads to the American Revolution. So here's how. Part of the 7 Years' War was the British fighting in America to, from its point of view, protect its American colonies. Great Britain waged a costly war to secure its empire in America, and now it needed to consolidate those gains. Thus, Britain would have to leave a standing army. So the British now are going to have a big military presence in the American colonies. And armies are expensive. They need to eat. They need lodging. And that's going to put a stress on the American colonies. And the soldiers need to get paid. And that requires taxes. And from the British point of view, those soldiers are there to protect the Americans. So the Americans should pay for them for that protection. From the American point of view, those British soldiers, like, we don't need them here. Why are we paying for them? They can go home. So that obviously causes some conflict, which years later will become what we know as the American Revolution. In terms of trying to raise revenue to pay for this army in America, the British start taxing certain things. The Revenue Act placed a tariff, talked about that earlier. A tariff is a tax on imports, a tariff on imported sugar. So think about if you live in Massachusetts, the climate in Massachusetts does not allow sugar to be grown in Massachusetts. It's mostly grown in the Caribbean. Either way, wherever people in Massachusetts are getting sugar, it's not in their backyard. By definition, they're importing it from somewhere, right? So the Revenue Act, for example, says, anytime anyone in New England has any sugar, there's an extra tax put on it to help pay for that war that was just fought. The Quartering Act forces colonies to provide accommodation to British soldiers, to give British soldiers play, right? The British are saying, we're not going to pay to build barracks and forts for our people. You, Americans, you figure it out. Build housing for our soldiers. And that's going to cause a stress, simple supply and demands. There's a bunch of soldiers, there's not enough housing. Now rents are going to be more expensive. That's going to cause resentment. The Stamp Act placed taxes on paper products. Today, it is very easy to have a fully functional, involved life in this country without using any paper products to do business, to buy things, to communicate with people. Back then, it's impossible. You can't communicate without paper. You can't get information without paper. You can't do anything without paper back then. Things that today we can do electronically or digitally, that didn't exist. So a tax on paper was a huge, like, there's no way to avoid that tax. And this whole scheme became, from the American perspective, what's known as taxation without representation. You probably heard that. We all pay taxes. Nobody likes it. It's a reality of life. The argument was not the principle of we have to pay taxes to pay for our government. The argument from the American perspective was, we're paying taxes to a government that we don't have the right to vote for our representatives, right? We need to be able to vote for or against the people that are taking our money through taxation. As just a basic premise of, in a republic, you're supposed to be able to vote for your representatives. And the British claim to represent us, but at the same time, they don't allow us to vote for or against the people that allegedly represent us. Pretty basic, straightforward argument. Last couple things, just kind of preview the political framing of the build up to the revolution. The American colonists, not all, agreed that the British were bad. We'll get to that in the next unit. But those who wanted independence drew their inspiration from the ancient tradition of classical republicanism. The Roman Republic was a big one, which held that representative government safeguarded liberty more reliably than monarchy. Again, the principle is if your government is scared of you voting against them, they'll be more responsible and they'll care more about protecting your rights. Whereas a form of government in which you have no say will eventually become corrupt and abusive. That's the theory. This is a quote from Thomas Jefferson, right? Any, uh, I'll paraphrase, right? Saying any government where you can't vote will eventually abuse your rights because you have no leverage over them if you can't vote them out of office, essentially. Another mainstream school of thought among the revolutionaries was the idea that power corrupts. One person or even a few people cannot be entrusted with governing because they would inevitably become corrupt and turn into despots. This was their view of human nature, that anyone who is given power will eventually become corrupt. Even if they have good intentions, even if they're a good person, that's the nature of power. It corrupts. Even in representative governments, even if you have the right to vote for people, you got to keep an eye on them. People were obliged to watch those in power at all time, right? The idea is even if you voted them into office, that doesn't mean they're not going to become corrupt over time. You need to keep an eye on them. And if they become corrupt, you have to be able to vote them out of office. You got to be vigilant. You got to keep an eye on the people that are running your country. One of the inspirations for this school of thought is a famous quote you've probably heard, or at least you've heard a paraphrase of it. Um, Lord Acton, ironically, was British. I cannot accept your canon that we are to judge Pope and King unlike other men with a favorable presumption that they do no wrong. So you're saying anyone, even if you admire and respect them, is capable of doing wrong. If there is any presumption, it is the other way against holders of power. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. That's probably the part that you've heard. Has nothing to do with you being a bad person. If we give you total power, eventually you will become corrupt. And so we want to try to set up a form of government in which no one can ever have total power, and where even the most powerful person in the government can be voted out and or be term limited out. Uh, Last thing is just the first, in retrospect, what's considered the beginning of the revolution. Um, the first kind of semi-organized battle, right? The bloodshed at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts. And in retrospect, wasn't clear at the time, right? It's not like people are running around, the revolution has begun. That's not how history usually works. But in retrospect, yes, this was the first battle, organized battle between the British and the American patriots. And ultimately, the inflection point was from the American perspective, the British were trying to take the Americans' guns. And we'll get to the Second Amendment when we get to the Bill of Rights, but to understand the psychology that persists in large parts of the country to this day of Americans clinging very tightly to their guns, we can see that psychology all the way back here, right? The American patriots um, were willing to start a war with the British Empire rather than surrender their firearms. So in retrospect, Lexington and Concord is looked at as the beginning of the military phase of the revolution. The revolutionary era lasted for decades, but the actual shooting war began with this event, right? So the actual conflict itself, we'll get into in the next unit. We're not going to spend a ton of time on the military component of it. The battle of this and General so and so outflanked the fleet. Most people aren't really that innately interested in that, so we'll kind of gloss over the military stuff very quickly. and then spend the rest of this kind of center of the course on the ideas, the political ideas that came out of it, because whether you like them or not, they still affect to a great degree our lives today. All right, so that's it for this unit. I will see you next time.